Welcome to the Worth Knowing live stream on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube, the Worth Knowing Substack. That's my Substack. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Twitch like Roy Kent. We're here, we're there, we're every frickin' where. And speaking of everywhere, the last 3 weeks has been everything everywhere all at once. And what I wanted to do today is catch our breath and understand a little bit better what's going on and talk about, most importantly, where we go from here. And I have a really outstanding guest to do that with today. I'm really excited to bring her on in a couple of minutes. But first, let's hit the mental reset button and just catch up. I don't think people fully realize, I don't think I fully realized what an astonishing 3 weeks it's been. 3 weeks ago, we were together on this live stream with my friend Dan Perry, former lead editor for the Middle East for the Associated Press. By the way, Dan's been writing his Substack from a bomb shelter in Tel Aviv during the conflict with Iran. So I know you'll join me in sending him our best. 3 weeks ago, Dan and I were here talking about 4 places that Trump had just found out he was absolutely dead wrong. And our point was that everything he was trying to do, everything he was claiming to be able to do around the world was going badly. Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and his economic fight with the entire world through tariffs. That was the backdrop for 2 weeks ago, when my guest was Greg Olear, and we talked about the astonishing amount of corruption that was in the news right then. The $400 million Qatari jet, the crypto dinners, and of course, selling pardons. This was to say nothing of the most blatant form of corruption, which was his so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, which blatantly cut 10 million Americans from healthcare coverage to pay for tax cuts for billionaires that would add $2.4 trillion to the debt. That was the backdrop for when things really began to accelerate 12 days ago, just 12 days ago, because that was the beginning of the meltdown between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, where Musk was trying to kill the big, beautiful bill and said Trump was in the Epstein files and called for Trump to be impeached. That was June 5th. The very next day, coincidence, ICE officers began conducting raids in Los Angeles. The next day. And as I said in last week's live stream, we know from reporting in the Wall Street Journal that this was a calculated exercise concocted by White House poltergeist Stephen Miller to make highly visible, provocative, performative, made-for-TV arrests to gain attention. And by the way, that not only worked and turned attention back to immigration, but it also distracted from that entire backdrop, that disastrous backdrop I just went through. It even distracted from the sneaky fact that Kilmar Abrego Garcia had been quietly brought back to the United States, despite Kristi Noem telling Congress back in March that he will never be allowed to return. So, of course, because this was a pre-planned operation from the beginning, Trump was ready the next day to send in the National Guard, which was, of course, intended to provoke unrest, which became justification for sending in the Marines, and also served as useful cover for the announcement from RFK Jr. that he was firing 17 members of the Center for Disease Control panel that oversees federal vaccine recommendations and replacing them with anti-vaccine conspiracy theorists. But we're not even halfway through the dystopian last week, which included Trump going to Fort Bragg, and as I wrote about yesterday on my Substack, delivering a vicious political attack speech in front of American military service members who had been pre-screened. Go to military.com, not a left-wing rag. You can look this up. I have the link in my Substack. They had been pre-screened and handpicked to ensure that they would be MAGA fanboys. They were also pre-screened for their physical appearance. No fat soldiers is the way the people in Central MAGA casting put it. Seriously. Leni Riefenstahl would have been proud of this effort, which, by the way, broke Pentagon rules, but no time to worry about that when interim U.S. Attorney for New Jersey and Trump's former personal lawyer, Alina Habba, was busy indicting a Democratic member of Congress, LaMonica McIver, apparently for the crime of being a Democratic member of Congress, and federal officers were handcuffing United States Senator Alex Padilla, also for the crime of being a Democratic member of the United States Congress, while claiming that he never identified himself as a senator, even though on video you can hear him loudly saying, "I'm a U.S. senator." And he was wearing a freaking U.S. Senate shirt. And then Israel started bombing Iran. A Minnesota state lawmaker and her husband were assassinated on the very same day that Trump was holding his big, self-aggrandizing, but actually small, barely attended, embarrassing, shriveling parade in Washington, D.C. that was dwarfed by one of the biggest political protests in American history. At least 5 million people marching in the No Kings protests against Donald Trump. So that's where we are. And like I said, I haven't even covered the half of it. And I raise all of that partly to say that I may have been wrong a week ago. Not afraid to say it. I may have been wrong when I openly mused on this show about whether Trump had set a trap in Los Angeles to distract all of us from his disasters, and whether, therefore, we should be trying to turn our energies away from more protests and toward other forms of political resistance in the fight against his authoritarian takeover. I mean, look, I'm glad, that thankfully my fears were unfounded, at least in terms of the No Kings protest. People behaved beautifully, admirably. And the contrast with Trump's little parade couldn't have been starker. That was great. It was a great relief. But you can see why I was worried, because with everything that I just laid out, with everything that's happened in just the last 3 weeks, Trump is still definitely doing better than he has every right to be. In medicine, there's something called the gateway theory of pain. It suggests that your nerve endings can really only deal with one sensation at a time. That's why putting Bengay or Icy Hot on sore muscles works. The feeling of heat floods the pain receptors that can't simultaneously process what's hurting you. And that's a little bit of what's been happening so far in June. There's a lot of pain, but our systems can only process one sensation at a time. And that's what takes us back to today's discussion. Because I want to understand better why more people aren't outraged by the authoritarian and corrupt overreach. And I want to think about where we go from here. We just had a great demonstration of the fact that there's a lot of energy out there to fight back. But if all we do is show up and peacefully march and then dust off our hands and say, well, that was great, see you at the next rally, we'll lose. We'll let Trump off the hook. So how do we press the case? What's working among the voters who we need to persuade? What's breaking through? How do we press the advantage? To get a handle on those questions, I feel like I need a social psychologist, and I also need a pollster. And fortunately, I brought you both in the form of one of my very favorite Democratic experts, Lauren Goldstein, who is both. And you're one of my longtime favorites online. We have done a podcast mini series together. You are sort of like my go-to to understand what's going on, both as your role as a psychologist and as a top pollster for change research. Oh, welcome back, Lauren. Like you were saying right before we got on the air, it's been a minute.
It's been a minute. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you again. That was a tough news recap to listen to, but I'm otherwise glad to be here.
Yeah. It was tough for me to say. And it was a little bit of I had to source it. I had to kind of like go through and like remind myself it really is drinking from a fire hose of gilded crap out of the Trump administration. And I want to say a very warm hello to all the people in the comments. It is awesome to see you you know what? Every week I feel better. We're gonna put you on the couch here, Lauren, because every week I get a little bit of uplift, a little bit of a mental refresh from seeing everyone kind of weighing in and chatting and kind of being together to do all this. And that's really where I want to start, because you had on your Substack, Mind the Gap, you had a little gap. You had a lacuna of ability to sit down. You were very forthcoming about it in your post from yesterday. You said, I'm just going to quote you, "I blinked and realized I've taken a hiatus from this newsletter. It was unintentional. Truthfully, the state of the country has been so bleak and overwhelming that I've dismissed every idea that floated into my head for being comparatively inconsequential. Trump weaponizes the military against civilians, and I'm going to write about how it polls. That still matters, but I'm struggling to execute." Talk to us a little bit more about that. I mean, because I feel like I feel the same way, and that really captured something for me. How have you been processing all this?
My answer to that is definitely varies depending on the day and the news and how much I've read it. I think part of my difficulty is sort of situating myself as a professional and also a human being, because the second that you sort of over-index on being a professional and marginalize the way that you feel, in my opinion, you immediately become out of step with the public, and you become out of step with the sentiment that you're trying to measure. And if you have no idea how to connect to people, then you're going to ask the wrong questions. And I've been having a bit of a hard time with that sort of dichotomy. I think that I feel sort of insufficient as a professional if I can't sort of put the hat on and execute and do the work the same as always, adjusting for the circumstances, but broadly the same as always. But then I also feel like if I go about my business as usual, I am just normalizing the abnormal. And it feels very strange to, produce messaging guidance or put out polling on how popular something is or isn't, without sort of pausing to acknowledge the gravity of what we're all up against right now. These are not normal times. So I blinked and 2 months went by where I was sort of unable to put pen to paper on anything, but trying to crawl out of my hole.
Beautifully said. I feel very much the same way. It's so hard to be analytical and to kind of separate yourself. But of course, as a scientist, that's what you have to do. You're both a data scientist and a scientist, right? You have to maintain your clinical reserve and your professional reserve and be able to look. And you're advising clients, you're advising democratic organizations and candidates all the time on how do we break this down. It's like, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? How do you break this down? How do you process it? How do we work our way through it? And you can't do that if you're bringing your own emotionality into the picture. And yet at the same time, in the field of psychology, and you and I share, I have a dilettante's obsession with psychology. You have a professional's obsession with psychology, but I revere Daniel Kahneman, and the way that he and Amos Tversky worked is they would do thought experiments in their own mind. They would test their own reactions to say, well, I'm a reasonable human. This is the way my brain works. So I can infer from that how other people's brains work. And you're sort of hamstrung in being able to do that, because that would seem to limit your own analytical reserve. It's a tough position you've put yourself in. But you know what you've done is you've substituted in your most recent piece a different form of analysis by way of using your expertise to give us some, I think, really valuable explanation. So let's start there. I wanted to understand the question that I set up in my opener there, which is like, I'm going to curse for a second here. Why the fuck aren't people madder about this? I know that we all are, like everyone who's on this live stream, but why are more members of the public, even more than the 5 million plus who showed up for these protests, why aren't they looking at this and just absolutely aghast? And you explained something really interesting that I hadn't heard before, which is the bicycle metaphor. So walk us through. You wanted to tell us more about why the authoritarian pitch sells. Tell us more about that, and tell us about the bicycle metaphor.
Yeah, sure. I think that, as I mentioned in the piece, I don't think there's been any lack of coverage of, rising authoritarianism in the country since Trump retook office. But I think that the focus has largely been on Trump himself as an individual sort of bad actor, an individual with fascistic impulses who is taking us down a dangerous path. What I wanted to pause and step back and examine a little bit was how authoritarianism operates in the mass public. What appeals for regular people about authoritarianism, and how does that function? So 20th century social psychologists who pioneered the study of, in particular, right-wing authoritarianism, they coined this bicycle metaphor. So if you picture a person on a bicycle and you picture what they look like on that bicycle, they are simultaneously hunched forward and kicking down on pedals. And they use that metaphor to sort of encapsulate the two components of right-wing authoritarianism in the mass public: bowing down to perceived legitimate authorities, bowing to power, and kicking down at the people who are below them in the social hierarchy. So people who exhibit right-wing authoritarianism have both tendencies. This duality exists. They're
Mm.
not just trying to punish people who are below. They're also willingly submitting to what they perceive as legitimately above them. So they're not necessarily defending a high position in a social hierarchy. They are defending their position as somewhere in the middle or even low, as long as they are not at the bottom, as long as that hierarchy is appropriately punishing the people who they perceive to deserve lesser treatment.
That I invoked Kahneman, Saint Kahneman a moment ago. That didn't he do a study on this where you would be willing to take less of a raise, provided that your neighbors didn't get more of a raise. Like you compare yourself to the people around you much more than you care about your absolute level of well-being.
Yeah, there's definitely an interplay with that sort of zero-sum mentality of, your gain would be my loss. Even if it's possible that we were actually in a circumstance where a rising tide would lift every boat, if there's somebody's boat that you don't want to see lifted, you're sort of willing to not experience advantage yourself, as long as people who are below you in the social hierarchy would not disproportionately benefit.
And is that the key? When you think about like the big beautiful bill, and gosh, I can't even say that with a straight face. Like we're having, by the way, I'm putting this up in the chat. Some of our favorite people who engage here in the live streams, including VD Hertz, are having some algorithmic issues with our friends at our corporate owned platforms, algorithmically blocking negative comments about Donald Trump. Let's try this. Let's see if they can apply it to audio. Donald Trump is an asshole. Let's see if that works. Did that work? Okay. Did that go through? Yes. Drumpf is the key. All right. So that's working. So I was going to ask, is this why Trump seems to pair abuse of certain outgroups, abuse of immigrants, like the whole, we've got to crack down, work requirements, that kind of thing. Is that why he pairs things that penalize his own voters, that go after his own MAGA base, with things that's like, yeah, well, I'm really sticking it to the people you don't like. So, you're still relatively better off than them.
It's an interesting question. I can't necessarily speculate about his motives as an individual, but I will say that that phenomenon can absolutely help explain why the bill is not more unpopular, or why more broadly, even if the bill is unpopular writ large, there is a subset of the population that is willing to suffer, as long as somebody else that they perceive deserves suffering suffers even more. And as long as the social hierarchy rankings are sort of remain intact and nobody is gaining on them that they don't believe has a right to gain on them. I think and
there's a racial quality to it as well. You cited some research that, you can get people to vote against their own economic self-interest, especially if you add this, like, well, it's going to be even worse for racial minorities or immigrants.
Or conversely, if you suggest to people that it's racial minorities or immigrants that are going to benefit disproportionately, you can invoke the desire to punish in those resentful white voters, and therefore self-sacrifice in the process. I think what you're getting at, though, is sort of the heart of the piece and the heart of one of my central arguments about how voters perceive information and how politics works from the lens of social psychology, which is there's this pervasive myth of voting against your own interests. I think we've all heard that expression. This idea that people who support Republicans, who are not personally wealthy or powerful, are somehow continuously voting against their own interests by voting for Republicans, because Republican policies don't make them healthier, they don't make them wealthier, they don't do anything to improve their material position, right? It's not giving them more health care, it's not putting more money in their pocket. What I think is fundamentally off base about that accusation in the context of this piece, there are a few reasons why I think that's wrong, but the one I want to talk about is it assumes that material self-interest is the only thing that motivates voters, when in reality, symbolic self-interest can be even more powerful under the right circumstances. Symbolic self-interest is basically a defense of your position in the cultural and social hierarchy. Do you feel important? Is your group considered prototypical? Are you favored? Are you powerful? Are you dominant? Do you matter more than other people? That can be a more powerful source of self-interest than material gain under the right circumstances. So when we say people are voting against their own self-interest, it's wrong. It might be that it's exactly in line with their symbolic self-interest.
Is this where the whole basket of deplorables thing comes in, where, the contrast here is Donald Trump literally telling the January 6th insurrectionists, "You are very beautiful to me." I mean, it's a little bit like Red Dragon, like the messaging to Hannibal Lecter. It's like, you are a wonderful genius. You're very beautiful to me. So like, buttering up these folks with like, "You're great. You were always great. I'll make you great again. I love you. I'm not going to judge you no matter what you do. By the way, I'm cutting half your Medicaid, but listen, but you're so great." And it's like the way you dump someone, right? It's like, it's not you, it's me. You're amazing. We don't work together. I'm moving out all my stuff. Like, I mean, is that essentially what he's getting away with?
You could argue that. I mean, the basket of deplorables comment was a tough one on multiple levels. I mean, sometimes Occam's razor, like the simple explanation is the right one. Like, conveying disdain for voters is not a great strategy, even if it's inadvertent.
I gotta say that I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a pollster. I did manage campaigns, some of them very successfully. I kind of intuited that one.
Yeah. That one's low hanging fruit, I think. So yes, partly there's that dynamic happening, but I also think, we have a tendency to mistakenly assume that people who require or rely on social services or have in the past are going to be automatically empathic toward other people in the same circumstance. And that's kind of an off-base assumption. So if I can psychology for a second here, we've talked about this before together, but fundamental
I love it when you verb nouns.
Fundamental attribution error is this idea that people tend to ascribe a reason for their own behavior to the circumstances that they were put in. But when they're evaluating why other people might do the exact same behavior, they tend to blame their personality. So for example, if I'm speeding on the highway, I had a circumstantial reason, right? I was keeping up with the flow of traffic, or the road is empty, there's nobody around, I'm being safe. If I see somebody else speed past me on the highway, I'm going to likely assume that that person is reckless or impatient or dangerous and disrespectful to other drivers on the road. I have a tendency to ascribe personality traits rather than appreciating the way that the circumstances and the situation impact our behavior. That dynamic, I think we see sometimes when talking to people who have relied on Medicaid or relied on SNAP, who are really disdainful in general of other people who use those same social services. I think fundamental attribution error can help us understand why this idea that, well, I needed it and I used it well. I didn't abuse the system. I'm not lazy. I'm hardworking. I just needed help for a brief period of time because XYZ circumstances were happening in my life, as opposed to other people abuse the system. They milk the system. They don't work hard. They don't have work ethic like I do. They don't deserve it. So there's also that element, I think, at play. And that sort of intersects with all these ideas about symbolic self-interest versus material self-interest. But again, voters are not these like rational consumers that are just trying to maximize money in their pocket at all times. There are other factors, other psychological factors and motivators that help explain why they behave the way they behave and why they might justify something like cuts to Medicaid and SNAP.
I want to bring things back to sort of the last 3 weeks of all of this, because we still have these multiple instances of like, shifting the window. Like, I mean, if I had just said without any preamble, Donald Trump's federal law enforcement officers, gang tackled a Democratic U.S. senator, his personal lawyer, who he appointed like without really any qualification as an interim U.S. attorney, is prosecuting a Democratic member of Congress. He's sending in the Marines for a few Waymo vehicles that are on fire. I mean, I'm not dismissing that there were some incidents of violence and looting. That is true. That is a true fact. Sometimes we who are, both Democrats and in the media generally dismiss these things too glibly. Okay. That's a big caveat here, but like, you don't send in the fucking Marines for that. Okay. So he's doing all these. If I had described those things in a vacuum, it would have shocked the conscience, but we've been sort of slowly, frog in the pot of water being brought to a boil, been brought to this point where it's like we've either had the zone flooded of our senses and we can't keep up with it, or we've been sort of, well, it's this, it's not such a leap from that. What is it about this authoritarian kind of the bicycle metaphor? Is there something that Trump is doing that's allowing him to get away with these increasing outrages?
Gosh, how much time do you have? I think it's a complicated question, and I don't think I'm necessarily the right person to answer every dimension of it, because some of this has to do with media ecosystem, quite honestly. But I would say there's something to the relentlessness of his relentless shamelessness and authoritarian impulses make it really difficult to stay on any one story for very long because there's constantly something else. I think that makes it difficult to cover. It can make it difficult for a story to stick, and it can make it difficult to sort of message consistently on it and keep it salient. That said, despite the challenges, the biggest challenge or obstacle in making a message stick is not trying. And I would say there is a lot that can still be done to reinforce the message and to make it salient in the mass public. Elites have the power to shape those stories. So, is there something in particular that he's doing? He's doing a lot of things all the time. And we don't have a unified media system that makes it easy for everyone to be on the same page about what happened that day. We don't all just sit down and watch the same evening news and then move on with our lives. So some of it is just how it breaks through, whether it breaks through, and whether the facts have been distorted by the time it hits the airwaves, depending on where you're sourcing your material, because everyone's going someplace else. So some of this isn't necessarily any brilliance of his and just a product of the environment that we find ourselves in, an incredibly fractured media environment.
Right.
But, one of the things that I think could definitely prevent him from getting away with everything is relentlessness on the part of Democrats and progressives in speaking out against it, rather than sort of shying away in favor of something a little bit milquetoast and safe. All
right, well, let's talk about that side of the ledger. So I, at the top, gave a little bit of a mea culpa for people who were on last week. That I was worried. I was worried that because the LA situation was such an obvious Trump trap, it had been so lab engineered to try to move the conversation, move the media focus onto ground that he found relatively stronger, that the entire setup of the No Kings protests could have been a trapdoor under us. Like it could have been something that went very, very badly. Now, it didn't turn out that way. I don't know that I was necessarily wrong that there was a risk there, but I'm thankful that overall, I think it was wrong. And I think, and I think we benefited overall. How do you feel, before I kind of push the what next question and the polling question, which I do want to get to, I want to use the other side of your brain. How do you feel about protests? How do you feel about protests as a mechanism for advancing the anti-authoritarian cause, for advancing a political cause like we are trying to do on Saturday?
I mean, I think they're hugely important. History can tell us that much. I went to my local protest. I think that there's tremendous hope to be found in participating. Like the simple act of immersing yourself in a crowd of like-minded people who are upset about the same things you're upset about and who want the same kind of solutions and to live in the same kind of world that you do is an incredibly important reminder that you are not alone and that you have agency. and that you have the ability to enact some change with your community and on behalf of your community. I think that is the purpose of a protest. So I think they're incredibly important and incredibly impactful. I'm 2 thumbs up on protests.
What do you make of this comment? And I love to bring it. I've been sort of trying to splash up people's comments on the screen. What do you but I haven't been able to read them out as we've been talking here. Sometimes after the fact, this goes up on podcast and people don't watch the video. Like, they just listen to it as a podcast, like cavemen. So MJ's point here is, speaking of like anachronistic technology, some of the history of the effectiveness of protest movements was written before social media. This is something that I got into with Michaeline Kroll, Bernie's former chief of staff, last week on this show is, look, she was the legislative director for John Lewis. She knows, being the right-hand lady for one of the great protest leaders in American history, she knows a couple of things about protests. Do you think the equation has changed? Do you think the equation has changed in the context of modern media, social media? And I'll just put up, as I filibuster this for another moment, I'm just going to put up MJ's other comment here to say that that 3.5% rule comes from work by a Harvard Kennedy School of Government professor, Ellen Chenoweth. As a Kennedy School alum, I feel like I have an inside track. So I actually emailed Dr. Chenoweth, anticipating MJ's point, yesterday to invite her onto either my podcast or this live stream. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. But what do you make of MJ's point?
So a couple things. I mean, number one, when you're asking this question of, are protests good for anything? I think it matters what your outcome variable is. Are you trying to see if somebody reading an old-fashioned mainstream media newspaper and seeing pictures and coverage of the size of the protest is more inclined to vote for a Democrat after seeing that? I wouldn't expect to see much of an effect there. But if the outcome is sort of renewed faith in one another, or renewed faith in the ability to push back or to band together and create something at the grassroots level and the community level to hold power to account or to make changes, I think I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that these are not still impactful. The other piece of it, though, is, I lost my train of thought on the other piece of it. I'll mention it if it comes back. But no, I remember what it was. If we look at historical protests, the ones that have made the most of an impact on our sort of social consciousness, things like civil rights era, I think at the time of his death, Dr. King was somewhere around 33% favorable with white voters. It matters how you measure it. It matters what angle you're looking at, right? Those protests were profoundly impactful. They had a ton to do with shaping public consciousness and creating a conscience in the white electorate about what was happening to Black people in this country. Also, a lot of their tactics were not necessarily universally popular. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was not universally popular. He was actually mostly unpopular with white people. So it matters how you measure it. Two things can be true. And I would never want anyone to sort of get mired in a specific finding or a specific way that we've sort of tried to quantify effects in a lab setting. I wouldn't want anyone to use that as a reason not to get involved.
That is, I think, at the end of the day, kind of a bottom line point for me. It's a real yes and. I've concluded that I like protests, provided it's part of an and. And I want to put in the parking lot something that I brought up in my preamble, which is I do want to talk a little bit about where we go from here and how we make sure it's not just a flash in the pan, that we operationalize it, that we build on the momentum. And I'm just going to preview for people here that you and I were chatting about this offline yesterday. And one of the things you previewed is you don't think there are easy answers. There's not like a magic bullet, silver bullet, pixie dust answer here where like you have a secret sauce as a pollster, and it's like, if we just say this gerund before this past participle, that will unlock people's brain. It doesn't really work like that. But I do think you've been, and your colleagues at Change Research have been laying some breadcrumbs for where things stand. So I want to pivot a little bit to the most recent piece of Change Research, and let's talk about where Americans are right now. Would you mind I want to do two things. One is I'd love if you could walk through a little bit of the recent findings coming out of Change on views on Trump's effectiveness, views on government corruption. Now, I've seen them. The other thing I want to do is, this is one of the perils of live streaming. I have someone who's persistently knocking at the door. So while you do that, I'm going to step away for literally 45 seconds while you get people going on this. I will be right back.
Okay, sure.
All right, here we go.
I'm going to talk to an empty screen. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, one of the things that we talked about yesterday is the fact that there's not a silver bullet to messaging. And I think that that's sort of a simple reality, but also one that we are too quick to sort of forget in favor of really rigorous testing, really careful sort of calibration based on how issues poll. And I think that that has bred a bit of a fearfulness in speaking out organically about something that matters to you and that you think should matter to other people, and or that you believe already matters to other people, and they want to hear somebody in a position of power say it and do something about it. So one of the findings, it's not from our June poll, but it's from a poll within the last couple of months. Welcome back. One of the findings that I would lift up comes from a piece that my talented colleague Ben Greenfield wrote about. We did this test of likely Democratic primary voters where we gave them two choices of candidate matchups. Would you prefer a moderate, ideological moderate, who's going to fight Trump really hard, or a progressive who is not going to make a huge fuss, not going to fight super hard? We also tested the inverse, a progressive who's going to fight incredibly hard, and a moderate who's not going to fight super hard, who's going to sort of collaborate, cooperate, and not be a thorn in the Trump administration's side. So what that double test allowed us to assess is the thing that people really want a progressive and not a moderate, regardless of how they interact with Trump? Is it the ideology that matters? Or do they want a fighter, regardless of where ideologically on the spectrum within the big tent they fall? And the answer is the latter, overwhelmingly. 90 to 95%, depending on which contest, prefer the fighter, regardless of whether that person is a progressive or a moderate. So I think that finding is telling, and I raise it here to make the point that when we're thinking about how we counter authoritarianism, when we think about how we take the energy from a protest and keep that movement going, and in particular, what role elites have to play, because protests are very much a mass public event, I think it's really important to bear in mind that people want this. I think that we need to sort of stop calibrating our messaging to the point that we are afraid that saying the wrong thing or the wrong combination of verbs and nouns and adjectives, if not phrased perfectly, is going to produce a loss instead of a victory. I think something that's impossible to quantify in that message testing, and I've been thinking about this myself because I do message testing too, and I always want to do it better, is what's the sincerity factor? Can I tell that you mean it? Is that message coming from the heart? Are you fighting on this? Are you going to bring the fighter spirit? Or are you just do you just sound like a politician, talking about costs and the kitchen table issues? Those matter. But do you sound oblivious to the moment that we're in? Do you sound like you just want to keep changing the subject? Or are you impassioned and are you fighting really hard? I think that is a key ingredient. And that's something that our recent polling has made abundantly clear. That's what voters want.
One of the things you're raising, I'm going to try to draw so many threads together that I'm in danger of losing them. MJ had brought up the point about whether protest and that equation has been altered in the era of social media. We've got Jim here saying gone are the days of Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, et cetera, kind of being the it used to be called in media, the voice of God, kind of like that authority figure in the chair. And we were all watching the same stuff. It was like 50 million Americans a night, an astonishing share when Walter Cronkite was at his heyday. Now CBS News, if you get 3 million, you're having an absolute bang up evening, right? And so, and proportionally to the population, it's an insane change. And I think one of the things that you're speaking to is a very odd effect that I'm seeing. I wonder, I'm going to put this out as a question to all of our friends who are viewing this on YouTube right now or are making comments. You are obviously YouTube consumers. You get your news, you interact. This is your information source. It's kind of like a social source, like we're all hanging together and we're talking about this stuff because we share common interests. I feel like the media product that's going up on YouTube has changed in the last 2 years. People on this chat know, you might have come to this through Cliff Schechter. I spent about 1.5 years kind of behind the scenes helping Cliff build the YouTube channel. And, I was a contributor and I was, doing stuff. I was editing his. We used to Cliff will tell you this. Ask him the next time you're on a live stream with him. Say, Matt told me a funny thing. We used to put so much time into editing videos to kind of be the YouTube optimum of, what they should look like and the number of jump cuts per, every 4 to 8 seconds and like the visuals and blah, blah, blah. What's growing like gangbusters on YouTube is straight to camera podcasts like this. What's growing on Substack is live streams, like what Cliff does on Thursday and what we're doing here. And I wonder see, I brought it around the bend, baby. I'm coming down the straightaway to the point you were making. I did it. Yes, I kept a mental thread going. I'm 51. This is incredible. I think maybe it's because of what you are talking about here, which is the authenticity factor, that something subtle has shifted in the way we experience information. Maybe it's because of social media. Maybe it's because of the disintegration of news, that what we really want is something we feel we can trust because it's authentic, it's real, it's not manufactured in a lab, it's not poll tested, focus group tested. Sorry, sorry, not sorry, my friend. And it's like, okay, it's unvarnished, and I don't like everything that this person is saying, but I know it's fucking real. Like I know they mean it. So I mean, this is a question to you and to all the people out there in the chats. Like, are you seeing it the same way? Are you experiencing this the same way?
It's such a fascinating phenomenon and dynamic that we're experiencing. I keep thinking back to like a comparison point in the 1960s when television became a lot more common.
Yes.
And the impact of television on attitudes about the Vietnam War. All of a sudden, these images were broadcast into people's homes and they could see it, and it was more visceral. And it really was an important factor in changing the tide of public opinion. I feel like we're living through something of a parallel in terms of social media today. In particular, young people, when I do interviews with voters, they will tell me when I ask them about media sources they trust, that TikTok is high on the list for a very specific reason. They feel like they are watching primary source material. And it sort of reminds me of work that I did in college in trying to understand how kids like between 5th and 12th grade trust and evaluate sources of information in science and also in history. And what so many of them would, in my opinion, somewhat misapply in terms of logic is the same idea of a scientist in a lab and a person on the ground from a historical context. So they would tell me that the most trustworthy source on a historical event is an eyewitness, someone who was there, someone who lived it. And they would make this sort of comparison to a scientist in a lab. I would most trust a scientist who like conducted an experiment and had their hands in it and saw it happen and can sort of immediately register the results. The same is true for a historical event. And the reality is that's not quite the case. It's sort of dismissing an entire field of expertise, which is historians who can collect a lot of primary source material and aggregate it and summarize it and create context and narrative and important details that help us understand and situate a moment in time beyond one person's primary source account. So I really understand what people are saying. There's historical precedent for that sentiment, but I worry about it.
First of all, Cynthia Rice, I hope you wouldn't give up live streams. I mean, give up other live streams, but not this one, clearly, right? Yeah, and MJ, good question. Like, let's put this out there. Wait, hold on, I missed MJ. Here we go. I don't have TikTok, where the protests a huge topic there. Please, someone who has TikTok, answer that. I would really love to hear it. You know, my kids have the same kind of YouTube brain. They love watching videos that I have to say, oh gosh, they're really entertaining. And I don't want to admit it because it's like I can see my child's brain melting out their ears. But, you know, like my 9-year-old will, you know, like he sounds like Cliff Clavin. He's like, did you know, little known fact about the NBA? And then he'll make up, did you know that Bill Russell was 14 feet tall? No, he wasn't, son. No. I'm telling you. And it's like, it's such an odd melange of misinformation, distorted information. But what really works is the immediacy of like, it's on video and they believe it because they're watching it. Like there was some insane test my daughter was watching of, are baseball players better athletes than basketball players? Clearly not. Okay. My favorite athlete of all time is Big Papi, David Ortiz. I love that man. I've met him. He is delightful. Like, no, I should say he's one of my favorite human beings. Like, I love that dude. No one is going to mistake him for one of the top athletes on earth. Okay. But because it's got this like YouTube verisimilitude to it, it's like she totally buys what she's watching. And anyway, there's something to that. Okay. So let's get into kind of maybe from that angle, this question of, all right, we gathered everyone together. We had the No Kings protests. We got a lot of people and a lot of energy. And speaking of which, there's a lot of commenting going on here, including, I don't want to skip over, even if you're trolling us, feel that steel. Okay, there is a diversity of opinion in the chats. I welcome it. I am not afraid of it. But the majority of opinion is like, it was great. It made the military parade look freaking stupid. What do we do now? How do we turn that from like, you know, an explosion of fireball into something that's like productive working energy? And one of the ways is through effective messaging, like understanding the media we need to use and understanding the message, noting that there's no magic words here. But what are you seeing in your polling that kind of points the direction? What's resonating? What's working with not the people who are in our camp who are going to show up to the protests, and not the people who will never, ever listen, the people we need to reach? What might break through?
I mean, you're sort of touching on, I think, one of the central tensions that's been swirling in the Democratic messaging water for a year, which is, do you stay laser focused on kitchen table issues? Do you talk about the economy and tariffs, and do you just sort of stay there? Or do you respond to the anti-democratic trends and threats? Do you speak about them? Do you do your best to make them salient? Do you respond? And that includes everything from disappearing people off the masked ICE agents disappearing people off the street and sending them to gulags in other countries. That includes Trump trying to overrule courts. It covers all measure of authoritarian impulses. I think the central what the data suggests to me is that a couple things.
Oh, wait. Oh, hold on. Are you going to talk about data?
I'm going to talk about data. Is that okay?
Oh, well, then I have to introduce this with our favorite video intro for our Do the Numbers segment. Here we go.
Nerd alert!
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
All right. Go ahead.
That was amazing. Thank you for that. That's like my walk-up music. Gosh, what was I saying?
I messed you up. Yes.
Yeah.
Folks, you have to realize that Lauren has the expertise that I've always aspired to have. So nothing gives me more enjoyment than having someone who's smarter than I am and more accomplished than I am, throwing her off her game a little bit. All right, go ahead.
I don't
Back
know
to
about
you.
that setup, but yeah, where were we before the data nerd insults started?
Oh, you were about to say what the data suggests is.
Yeah.
Yes. I totally messed you up.
You did. I think I
Well,
lost my train of
one of
thought further
okay,
upstream.
one of the things that Change Research has
Yeah.
been saying, and I should say that you are at Change Research, but not all of your opinion. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of the organization Change Research. That said, what you and your colleagues have shown is that the corruption message does seem to penetrate a little bit. Is that one of the directions you were going to go?
I mean, I think what I would broadly want to say is it doesn't need to be this either or of talk about the economy versus respond to current events. And there's a notion that everything that isn't the economy is some sort of distraction or trap. And I would push back on that. I would push back on that notion because what is this a distraction from? So in all of my interviews last year with voters, when I would ask them about, I found my data again. When I would ask them about what bothers them about politics, what bothers them about politics in our system and also just politicians in general, they would basically all say the same few things. They put personal ambition ahead of actually delivering for regular people. It just becomes about partisan bickering and winning and not about actually doing anything. And this idea that they sort of say one thing and then they go back on it. They overpromise or underdeliver, or they sort of campaign on a particular message and then they sort of drop it once they get what they wanted. What they really crave in the way of solutions, what would make this political project better for them? People who actually walk the walk and follow through. Don't just say what you're going to do and then backtrack. Actually show up and do the work. Deliver for regular people. Don't make this about your sort of personal political vendetta or your personal political ambition. And I think that is the framework through which I evaluate this question of, is it the economy or is it, the threats to democracy? It's absolutely both, in large part because of what we campaigned on. And I know that there's internal debate within the party right now, and has been for the past year, about what the right message was to go with in terms of how to position Kamala Harris. Was it just all talk about the economy in an attempt to sort of overcome the anti-incumbent sentiment and not be perceived as the status quo candidate? Or was it to explicitly talk about Trump's threats to democracy? I think that there's not necessarily a perfect way to do either. There's definitely poor ways to do both. So I'm not a big fan of the dichotomy in general. I think you have to talk about what's happening. And all of these things are happening. But one thing that I would caution, or that I would lift up from the data and caution about, is I would argue that campaigning against Trump on the basis of him being a wannabe dictator with fascistic impulses who wants to topple democracy from within because it serves his personal agenda. If we are going to campaign that that's Trump, and then once he's in office, refuse to talk about it while it happens and convert to talking about the economy, we are arguably doing exactly what it is that voters tell us they don't like about politics and politicians, which is you say one thing and then you do another. You talk a big talk and then you go back on it. You make all of these promises and claims, and then you don't actually fight for any of it. And so what I would caution in thinking about that, which do I do, is bear in mind what arguments we have historically made against Trump for very valid reasons, things that we believe in, and how voters perceive you if you stop fighting for them the moment that the threat becomes real.
Wow, there's so much to unpack in that. That was great. I'm glad you found your data. I will try not to throw you off anymore. What really, so much of that connects for me. And, one of the threads that really resonated was this issue of follow through and people knowing what you're about, and your earlier point about authenticity. People know what Donald Trump is about. I have Republican friends, believe it or not. No, I have genuine Republican friends. And what they were warning me in the run up to the election was for they're mostly for the most part, they are not Trump people. They're Republicans, they're not Trump people. And what they're saying is like, look, I know a lot of Trump people, and they're saying, we know he's crazy. We know that he's avaristic. I'm making up a word there. We know that, like, he's greedy. He's a charlatan. He says a bunch of shit that, like, we know that it's like dribbling out of his mouth, but we know what he's about. We know what he's fundamentally about. And, what we really want above all things is change. What we really want is we're just not happy. And to me, the leitmotif that runs through, just to use $1,000 word there, that runs through all of this is the theme of change. The theme that people are fundamentally unhappy. It shows up in social survey after social survey. And they can't, like, if you've ever had a cranky toddler, boy, I'm not meaning to infantilize the entire American public, but you reach a point where they're cranky. Something's bothering them. They're hungry or they're tired or something, but they don't quite have the words for it. And yeah, I'm infantilizing the American public. I take it. I'm sorry, but that's a lot of what comes through, is that people are feeling a certain amount of distress. And maybe it's like Murder on the Orient Express. Spoiler alert. Maybe there are multiple culprits here. Maybe it is the comparative of social media, kind of in the way you were talking about the social psychology of, other people are doing better than I am. Why am I not doing as well as them? You constantly see the curated living their best lives version on social media. Maybe it is the actual economic distress that people have been going through. But whatever it is, it's this core unhappiness. And what it leads to is the political trump card for 30 years now has been change. It's been whichever party grabs the mantle of, we think things need to change and we are the agents of that change, wins the election. But the key part that you just put your finger on is you got to walk the walk. You got to mean it. So all the conversation that's been going on about the economic message for Democrats, and, well, maybe it's the abundance agenda. Maybe we need to be all about that. If you read the fine print on that, what it means is you've got to upset some Democratic Party apple carts. You've got to actually be disruptive. There are some sacred cows that you need to sacrifice on the Democratic side, including, rules and regulations and lawsuits. And I guess my point is, what I would be into, and this is really, really hard to achieve, is a Democratic Party that was able to, maybe it's not so much about democracy and fascism. Maybe it is about change. Maybe it's about, there is something that is off track in America, and we are going to fight like hell for you. And what that looks like is, like the economic story needs to change. Now, Trump's villains in that story are immigrants and China. And we're not disagreeing. We're not totally disagreeing that there have been negative economic effects from immigration or from trade. We agree with that. But, we're going to point at some other villains, and we're going to fight against them, including ones that have been associated with our brand as a party. And this is a long screed, but I mean, that's sort of the direction I'm going. I'm accepting your point that it's not an either or, and it doesn't have to be fascism versus the economy. Whatever it is, though, to me, it has to be real. You have to make it real, and you have to be willing to change yourself. Okay, I just said a lot. I'm giving you a lot to work with, and it's okay to disagree with me and tell me I'm wrong. What do you want to pick up on?
Well, no, what you were saying was making me think about status quo perceptions and the problems with how we have talked about threats to democracy thus far. Because I think it is fair to call out what we have not done successfully, but I just want to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The idea that we just sort of seed ground and don't talk about threats to democracy because we haven't done it successfully yet doesn't mean that those threats are any less existential or important to talk about. One of the sort of central piece of it that I think we need to figure out how to do better is democracy is kind of a meaningless word, right? Like, what is democracy? Unless you are a political hobbyist and you can sort of rattle off 3 or 4 things that it means to you that are positive right now. I would venture to guess for most people, democracy is it's so vague. You project things onto it. And if democracy is vague and you're projecting things onto it, and you have general dissatisfaction with the status quo, then defending democracy sounds like defending the status quo. And a lot of important constituencies to the Democratic Party, low propensity voters, younger voters, voters of color, feel betrayed by the democratic system. It is not working for them as it should. So this idea that I'm going to protect it from Trump implies status quo is comfortable. Stick with it. Everything works, and we just need to get rid of him and put it back how it was. In reality, it's not working. It's not working for a ton of people. And again, if you want to push back on that by saying, well, that's not democracy writ large, that's the economy, or that's not democracy writ large, that's Congress. Again, it's a vague word people project. It's all sort of part and parcel of the same thing. It's this idea that our democratic system, our process is not yielding results. So if you cast yourself as the defender, you're in trouble because, to your point, what people are hungry for is change.
That's so important as we've been dealing with the Doge stuff is the message can't be we need to reset things. And I've been getting into a long conversation. I've got to, for people who are on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube, if you see my friend Ann Kim, who is a Capitol Hill colleague of mine who writes about the economy, largely she's an economic expert. We've been having an email conversation about this, a long diatribe email conversation about this, and about, what is the Democratic Party stance on the economy? And I think it kind of comes down to our whole philosophy of, well, what's the role of government? Because so many of our solutions that we put out do tend to sound like, well, I've got another big government program where we're going to redistribute wealth from these people to these people. And that's, and I'm not sure that either sells or genuinely works. Notwithstanding, it works in healthcare, but I'm not sure as an overall economic growth and vitality initiative that category of answer works. And, I think as much as I'm struggling with it, and look, I've been a campaign manager and a chief of staff in Congress. So I've been on the political side, the campaign side, the policy side, and my undergraduate and graduate training is in economics. I struggle to answer this question. And so if I'm struggling, I think the party writ large is struggling. And that's a piece that I think we've really got to get a handle on. All right. I want to do a quick programming thing. I've held on to you for an hour. Can you make it 5 more minutes?
I think so.
Is anyone knocking at your door? Okay. I'm going to filibuster this for a second. I want to throw one more question at you. But I'm going to give a little promo I'm going to ask something to everyone in the chats. I've been wanting to do a new feature that I'm cheekily calling Matt GPT, where people can ask any question of Matt GPT, and I will give you a well-researched answer based on source material, and I will sometimes hallucinate. So this is a wide open, it's like an old-timey radio call-in show vibe. If you have a general politics or policy question or any old question that you would like to throw into the chats, I'll try to pick one in 2 or 3 minutes. This is an experiment. I have no idea if this is going to work. And I will not only give you the Matt GPT answer, I will prompt for a Lauren GPT answer. And you can take the challenge with me as well. You had no idea this was coming. This is going to be fun. Or no one's going to pose any questions to us. So we'll see. So that was my promo. We will try to get to it. So throw a question into the chat. Let's see what we come up with. In the meantime, let me get you out of here on one final question. Based on all of your expertise as a psychologist, all of the data that you have at your fingertips in polling, and everything that you've been keenly observing over the last few weeks, some of the success and forward progress we've made in the protests and in the media picking up on some of, some of the disaster, at least. If you could pick one thing for the Democratic Party to do over the next 6 weeks, let's say you're whispering into the ear of Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, Gavin Newsom, all the powers that be, what would it be? What one action or piece of advice would you give them?
Gosh, that's a big question. I mean, I think I'm going to sort of return to the central tension that we sort of kicked off talking about, which is this, like, I'm a human being, and also, I have a professional skin in the game. And I think I'm just going to err in the direction of being a fellow human being and Democratic voter who cares, who cares. And that would be, I think my wish would be the best way to convey that these are not normal times is to not play by normal rules. The idea that we are going to bipartisan our way out of anything, that we are going to collaborate and cooperate our way out of anything at this moment in time, I think is just a fundamental misread of how the system has changed, how the power balance has changed, and not for the better. So I think just a citizen, as an informed citizen, I would say my wish / advice would be get caught trying. Fight.
That's what I'm seeing in the chats as well. That's what people want. That's what your polling is finding. That's what your focus group is finding. People want to see some fight and get caught trying. Okay, well, the question, I may not have given people enough advanced warning to come up with their questions for the Matt GPT segment. So again, this is an experiment. Like I said, this is the fun of live streaming, is you don't know where it's going to go. But I did get one comment / question here that I'm going to interpret as being a general question, which is, what is Trump planning for Canada? So I'm going to try and tackle this. And if this is not the way you meant it, well, I'm going to take it that way anyway. I'm going to lean on what Lauren was saying at the top of the show. I think that this is maybe an example of a little bit of the bicycle metaphor. Trump excels at picking out villains, even unlikely villains. Like any bully, he likes to identify the kid in class who, maybe has a little bit of a hard time standing up for themselves. If Canada has one image out there, it's that they're so aggressively nice. My gosh, in my consulting life, I went to a professional meeting as a consultant in Canada, just a table full of Canadians, and bless them, they all started by saying, "Oh, I'm sorry for what I did." "Oh, no, that makes me feel sorry." "Well, I'm sorry." It was so cute. And that's sort of the image. And I think Trump, weakness is provocative. Jack Kemp said that. Weakness is provocative. Trump sees a potential foil and he's going to attack them. And that's what we're seeing with Greenland. That's anytime. Now, it does, in some cases, it doesn't apply, right? It doesn't apply to China. China is a pretty robust competitor. But I think that's what his whole game is with Canada and this whole 51st state thing. He's just trolling. He's just being provocative, and he thinks he has a target that isn't going to fight back. And he loves picking on targets like that. And with Trump, there's always a little bit of, if you've ever been in a situation back when, I don't know, some of the people out in the chats there are probably still in the dating pool. If you ever been in a situation where you were on a date and you weren't sure whether to make a move or not, so you'd sort of, you jokingly suggest something, but you're kind of hoping maybe you get a positive response. I think there's an element of that with Trump. I think it's like, yeah, I'd love to make you the 51st state. Are you interested in that? Like, is that cool? Can I do that? That's what I think is going on. It's mostly a trolling thing. And I have one more here. Lauren, I want to let you weigh in on the Matt GPT segment. We've got one more question. But did you have any
on this one? Sorry.
Yeah. Do you have any reaction on Canada?
You know, I think that the bully metaphor is apt. And the thing about bullies is they're pretty weak. You know, I think he's all bluster. The second that somebody sort of has a greater show of strength in his, against whatever it is that he's pushing for, he backs down. He's quite weak. Most of the things that actually have been executed under him are things that other people were responsible for carrying out.
I think that's a great segue to another question here from Lefty Gramps, one of my favorite commenters. What do you think of the scope? Do you think the scope of the protests on Saturday will give the regime pause before using military in other cities? I think your last answer, Lauren, is the perfect answer for this. I do think that Trump is a chicken hawk. He likes, it's like those old cartoons, I'm a chicken hawk, and like Foghorn Leghorn will also, like he is a bully at heart who's also a weakling at heart, right? Like he's Admiral Bone Spurs, and he is very happy to pick on weak targets. He's very happy to pick on defenseless migrant moms who can be deported if you send like 12 ICE officers to take them down in a courtroom, right? That's a great target for him. I don't know if the scope of the protests will directly impact the thinking of the White House. But I think what will affect the thinking of the White House is the way you stand up to bullies is you fucking fight back, and you've got to kick their ass at some point. And, I think the aggressive legal response is good. And I think any action, like Democrats in Congress, like let's get some real people out there out front. Not another press conference. Like I've set up so many of these congressional steps press conferences in my day. Like, no, give me real people out front that you're with, that you're fighting with, and that you're not going to take a stand on. Identify the officers involved, find them, pick them out, put pressure on them, launch a civil suit, use the courts, use the pressure of the media. These people surely do not want to be identified. Use the power of social media. They're doing things that are illegal. Use that kind of pressure. I think weakness is provocative, and I'm not sure if the scale of the protests is going to show that maybe deploying the military isn't a good move. But I think fighting back aggressively against it with real people who are hurt by things like this. And there's another risk here. There's another side of this. Like if someone who is deployed by Trump is part of quelling a protest or some kind of illegal enforcement, and they hurt someone, well, now you're in a whole, now you've created a whole, firestorm on the other side. And that's something that our side can use too. Thoughts, Lauren?
I think I would just add, I think it's very easy to land in a comfortable place on the spectrum of political hobbyist to political activist, where we're sort of armchair quarterbacking ourselves. We're wondering how other people are responding to things, and we're trying to project the next behavior. I would say I understand the impulse, but wherever possible, choose a step in the activist direction of the spectrum, rather than waiting to see whether Trump is shameless enough to double down on this strategy or not. How did the protest make you feel? Go tell 3 people.
All right. Well, we can be the authors of our own virality. And virality is something that apparently RFK Jr. does not believe in, but we do here on the Cliff's Edge and Worth Knowing live stream. All right, Lauren, you have been very, very generous with your time. I hope just taking us back to the top of this, where you were feeling, your Mind the Gap Substack, which is very worth reading. People, if you want to get your hands on data and very intelligent analysis informed by psychology and numbers and actual knowledge, this is the place to go. And you were referencing the fact that you had taken a little hiatus because all of this is just a lot to process, even for mega minds like yours. And I hope that this experience that I have every week with, these folks on the live stream, I hope it was helpful for you. I hope it was somewhat therapeutic. I always find it helpful for me. So thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much. It was really fun. I appreciate it.
It was absolutely great to see you again. I will catch up with you offline. And I want to give a preview for everyone that next week we'll be back here 2:00 Eastern on Tuesday, where our guest will be Amanda Littman, the organizer behind Run for Something, the founder of Run for Something, one of the most dynamic leaders in politics on the Democratic side, doing the Lord's work. And she has a new book out. So yeah, we're promoting her book a little bit. Okay. We're doing a little book promotion, but we're going to get into all kinds of things. She actually has a Substack where she runs feel good updates. And it's usually about how we are winning down at the local level, down at the state level, where it's not going to break into the news. You might not see it. But every time I get her on my show, I always get information that makes me feel a little bit better. So looking forward to that. Hope to see everyone next week. And in the meantime, take good care of yourselves. Don't let the MAGAs get you down. All right. See everyone next week.